Recording. Okay, excellent. I've forgotten every other previous meeting, so good times. Right, yeah, so this is quite an informal thing. And Katie, if you're okay with this, if people put their hand up during the talk, if they have any pressing questions, I think that might be quite nice. So yeah, this is part of our monthly seminar series where we try and kind of get interested people together to talk about real-time analysis and the various different shades. So it started really with a nowcasting, right truncated count correction theme, but we're kind of broadening into general real-time infectious disease analysis. Yeah, and today we have Katie Gostic from the CFA talking about the CFA, a new center at the US CDC focusing on building response-ready modeling tools. How exciting. So I think that's very in line with what a lot of people are doing. And just full awareness, I'm doing some consulting at the CFA, and Katie's maybe my boss. So I'm pretty biased. But take that as read. So Katie is the nowcasting and natural history team lead at the CFA in the Predict branch. Previous to this, they had a McDonnell Foundation Complex Systems Fellowships. Wow, very exciting. In the Sarah Kobe lab, working on immune processes. And I met Katie through a paper on practical considerations for estimating the reproduction number, where she reached out and was like, do you realize everything you're doing is wrong? Would you like to do it not wrong? And then I was like, yes, I would like to do it not wrong. And then I completely changed what I was doing. So yeah, Katie, go right ahead. I'm excited.
Thanks, Sam. I think the reproductive number paper was definitely a team effort. You and Sam told us we were doing, or you and Seb told us we were doing some things around too. But thanks for the introduction. Also, can you just help me, if I don't see a question, let me know. Feel free to interrupt me. Still learning to use Zoom on a Windows computer. And let's see. Lovely. So you guys can't see your faces, but you can see my screen. Are we good? Yes, good. Okay, let's get started. So I have to start with this disclaimer. These opinions are basically my own, not necessarily the official position of HHS, CDC, or the US government. And now let's get to the fun stuff. So this is going to be a pretty high-level talk. I'm not really going to go into technical details or methods, but I just want to start by saying a few words about the challenges of real-time outbreak response analytics and what led me to join CDC and specifically CFA. Then I'll say a little bit about this new center, and at the end, I'm gonna say a little bit more specifically about, I guess, how my thinking has changed about nowcasting and real-time parameter estimation since I joined CDC and learn more about how the data are collected. So let's start by talking about the challenges of real-time response. And I know that everybody is sick of hearing about COVID, but I just can't help but thinking back to early 2020 when the pandemic was starting and there was just so much uncertainty. And here I was, I had a PhD in epidemic modeling, and it felt like if anybody out there should be prepared to deal with the situation, it should be me. And yet I did not feel prepared at all. I definitely remember really early in the response, there was this line list and it was being kept in a Google Doc. Researchers were literally just reading case reports and trying to compile and deduplicate things in real time. And I remember I took that data and I just wrote up a really simple likelihood and did maximum likelihood estimation to try to estimate some parameter like the incubation period without doing any kind of data pre-processing or correction. And a few months later, it became abundantly clear to me that that was not the right thing to do. And I was really glad that I hadn't publicized it because my answer almost certainly would have been very wrong without thinking really carefully about how to treat the data in advance. And I'll give a more concrete example that focuses on RT estimation. So this is an example of an RT estimate that was generated really early in the pandemic using case data from Wuhan. And so clearly what was done here is the authors just took the data that was available at the time. I think this was published by April 2020, so like really early in the outbreak. And they fed it into existing methods that had been developed prior to the pandemic to estimate RT. And then clearly the goal here is to overlay these estimates with annotations about what levels of intervention were in place at different points in time. And so this is the kind of thing that we'd like to be able to do well in order to guide public health decision making, right? Or to help people assess whether the interventions that are being put into place are effective. But there are some issues with this analysis. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the sort of suspiciously narrow credible intervals, given how early in the pandemic these estimates were made. It's also really essential if these kinds of analyses are going to be used for decision support that they're temporally accurate, right? Really often what we're trying to do is infer whether the reproductive number is above or below 1. But if we get the timing of the point where RT crosses 1 wrong, it can tell us incorrect things about the impact of different interventions. So, the timescale of this x-axis is really tight. It's only a few months. And so if we're off in time by just a few days in either direction in this analysis, we can get a qualitatively different answer than what we would have gotten, or rather than the truth. And so this is just kind of a teaser for some of the themes that I'm going to talk about in the next section, but I think what I realized working on the pandemic response is that if we're not incredibly careful about really fussy details and how the data are adjusted and pre-processed as we do what seem like basic modeling analyses, then we can easily get the wrong answer. And so I came out of the pandemic really with this new perspective that if we want to do outbreak response well, then we need to think both as modelers and as engineers, right? Our computational analysis tools should be built to anticipate and adjust for predictable problems in the data, or else we're not going to be able to do these analyses quickly and get the right answer. Okay, so that brings me to CFA. So CFA is the newest center at CDC. We were stood up in 2020 using funds from the American Rescue Plan, which was like the big stimulus package in the US that supported pandemic response. And I think we officially became established as a center in April 2021. So we're a little bit over a full year old at this point, and we're really in a growth phase. We're hiring a lot of people and kind of starting to get our feet on the ground. And we're lucky that we've convinced Sam to come consult for us, despite many HR hiccups and the fact that he still doesn't actually have an official login, but we're working on it. So the mission of CFA is to enable timely and effective decision-making during infectious disease outbreaks. And so one of the main ways that we're going to try to do this is by following through on the kind of vision that I laid out in the first section. So CFA is trying to take best practices from the modeling and response literature and merge them up with good implementation practices so that if there is an outbreak, we have tools that are pre-positioned, tested, and ready to go on the shelf so that we can focus on the unpredictable aspects of the response or data. And so that modeling work is mostly going to happen in Predict, which is one of our 3 divisions. But there are other divisions that are going to support this work. So we also have Inform, which is our communications division. And Inform is really there to recognize that scientific communication is a skill that takes dedicated time, and also that coordination with the kinds of local, state, tribal, territorial public health organizations that might be interested in using or interpreting these analyses is also kind of a full-time job that shouldn't be supported entirely by the modelers themselves. And then finally, we have this Innovate division, which really has 2 functions. So there's going to be one branch of Innovate that focuses on tech. So this will include software developers that help us with professional implementation practices, and data engineers that help us with the kinds of data management and cloud computing practices that we need to do analyses at scale. And the other arm of Innovate is going to be focused on sort of grants, contracts, and cooperative agreements and academic or private sector partnerships with people outside of CDC that are trying to help us push forward and improve the methods that we're using. So this is our very exciting org chart. I'm showing this to try to explain how we're structured within the Predict division. So as of this week, we have all 6 of what are called our team leads. So I'm going to be leading the natural history and nowcasting team, where we're going to be focused on implementing methods to take in the data as it's observed in real time, figure out what's going now, and estimate key parameters for downstream analyses. We also have a scenario modeling team led by Tom Hladish, which is going to focus on longer term kind of what if type projections, considering the impact of different possible interventions or epidemic trajectories, including virus evolution. We have a short-term forecasting team, which I think is pretty self-explanatory. That team is going to be responsible for the kinds of N-week ahead forecasts that we've seen for hospitalizations, cases, and deaths throughout the pandemic, and that CDC already produces for flu and dengue. Then we have these analytic response teams, which are going to be more focused on responses to questions from high-level federal decision makers, as opposed to kind of production of analyses on a regular cadence. And so these teams are going to focus on medical countermeasures and variants, which is going to be all about estimating things like vaccine effectiveness and intervention effectiveness in the face of variant evolution. Community mitigation and economic impacts is going to be focused on estimating epidemic trajectories and the impacts of interventions at the population scale. And then key populations and settings is going to zoom in and think about more of sort of the network dynamics or smaller scale modeling problems in key settings, including schools, nursing homes, prisons, and other places where we need to think outside of the homogeneous mixing paradigm. So each of these teams is going to have a lead with 4 or 5 data scientists and modelers working underneath us. I think of each of the team as sort of analogous to an academic lab that's focused on a particular set of problems and is going to become specialized on using and implementing a particular suite of tools. But I do think there's going to be a lot of collaboration between the teams because, as you can imagine, the lines between them are a little bit gray and blurry in certain applications. And so the primary purpose of CFA is to support federal level decision-making in the United States. So the main people that we need to answer to are folks like the CDC director, the White House, and CDC emergency incident response managers. But part of our mission too is to try to increase capacity for modeling and analytics at more local levels, including for state, tribal, local, and territorial health agencies. And this is a particularly big deal in the US because we have 50 plus states and territories, 3,000 plus counties. And so this is a really big lift with potentially very large impact, especially because in the US system, in many cases, the states have power over their own data collection and decision-making or response policies. So we probably can't provide the analytical support to do analyses directly for every state or local public health department. But one of the things that we can do is focus on building tools that are open and transparent. So we're still kind of working on getting our foundations in place and establishing the kinds of tools that we want to use. But once we have essentially minimum viable products, our goal is to take the tools that we develop and make them open access on the CDC's public-facing GitHub. We really think that this is going to be important because we also, another one of our guiding principles is collaborativeness. So we really see ourselves being a center that is open to working with academic and private sector partners. We want people to be able to take and test and modify and help us improve the tools that we're developing even if they're outside CDC. And we just released a big notice of funding opportunity that will provide a pretty massive infusion of funding into the field to support this kind of work in academia and the private sector. One of our other guiding principles is mission impact. And so this basically means that we have to choose to work on problems that are going to have a direct line to supporting analyses that will help us make good decisions and save lives during outbreak analyses. So we're a little bit more constrained than maybe an academic department in the kinds of questions that we can work on. But I find it really motivating to have this kind of mission and to be doing this applied work. And then we also want to be equity focused. So one of the first things that we've been working on, especially led by Mark Lipsitch, is trying to fund data collection that would allow us to do a better job, including demographic covariates and social determinants of health in our modeling analyses. We think that one of the big issues, or one of the big barriers to doing this right now, is just lack of good data availability. And so we're trying to work with large data systems to try to remedy that problem. And we're also thinking about equity as we staff up and hire about 45 new data scientists and modelers. Okay, so people often ask me if I still get to do science in this position, and I think the answer is definitely yes, but this kind of science we're doing is really applied. So just to give you a non-comprehensive overview, some of the questions that I think about on a day-to-day basis are things like, what are the limits of forecast and nowcast accuracy for infectious disease, given that we know that our systems are influenced by things that are pretty unpredictable, like changes in human behavior? We're also thinking a lot about which modeling and inference methods are appropriate for different epidemic contexts. And in particular, I think that a lot of the tools that we're working on developing right now are focused on kind of the steady state seasonal outbreak context, like for flu and influenza. But I recognize that early in an outbreak is an entirely different situation where we might want to use more parameter light or parameter free statistical methods to get the answers that we need in real time very early in an outbreak when information is particularly limited. And I think the guiding question that drives a lot of our work in CFA is trying to understand how we draw responsible, accurate inferences from this kind of limited information that we have early in an outbreak. And as I said before, we think about real-time response and analysis as this is Sam's figure from EpiNow too, as an engineering challenge, not just a scientific challenge, right? So every time there's an outbreak, we deal with all kinds of predictable problems in the data. There are lags between the moment that an infection is observed and the moment that the case might be reported or show up in line list data. We see these day-of-week reporting effects where more cases are reported midweek than on the weekends when fewer people are working. We also know as nowcasters that we have to deal with partial observation of cases at the end of the time series and a whole bunch of other issues that are totally predictable and will inevitably be present in any outbreak data set. And this is adjusting for these issues is almost the first step before an analysis for downstream parameter estimation or forecasting or scenario projection can even begin. And so we're thinking about how to build pre-positioned, well-tested computational tools to enable these kinds of best practices in real time. And we're thinking hard about things like ensuring reproducibility, using environment management and containerization to ensure reproducibility, and also to make sure that the tools we develop are portable between the vast ecosystem of computational platforms that we have access to at CDC. We're trying to implement good practices from software engineering, like code review and building test suites. And we're trying to make sure that everything we build is modular and ideally packaged so that we can reuse it and adapt it to new situations down the road, and so that we're not accumulating tech debt. And so really what CFA is modeled on is the National Weather Service. So this is a figure showing the improvement of weather forecasts from the 1960s to the present. And kind of the takeaway here is that we see weather forecasts as being pretty reliable and trustworthy, but those forecasts have improved incrementally over time, and it's taken decades to get where we are now. And really, these improvements were enabled by sustained federal investment in things like data, models, and staff to do the kind of work that it takes to maintain a forecasting infrastructure for weather systems, and then to work with academic and private sector partners to continuously try to improve the models that we have in place and pull in new approaches when they can beat the standard system that already exists. And so, CFA is really just kind of in our big bang stage right now, but this is the kind of organization that we want to become for infectious disease forecasting. And we really think that infectious disease forecasting and real-time analysis is almost like we're back in the 1960s for weather forecasting. We think that we have a long way to go and that there are a lot of improvements that we can make as a field. Okay. Let us talk about some of the challenges that I've been thinking about in terms of implementing nowcasting in public health practice for the last few minutes. And then I'm also really interested in having a little bit of a discussion with you all at the end. Okay, so why do we nowcast? For decision support, we've talked about how analyses really need to be accurate and they also need to be timely, right? We need to be able to provide decision makers with answers quickly about the most recent developments in an outbreak. But of course, we all know that this is a problem because fundamentally epidemics are, or I have started to think about them as a series of linked delays, and these delays make it hard for us to know what's going on in real time. And so some of these delays are biological, right? We have to wait between the moment that a person becomes infected to the moment they develop symptoms or visit a healthcare facility and become an observable case. And then there are additional delays to reporting between the moment that that case is observed and it getting passed up to, say, state or local data systems. Finally, in the US, filtered up to national data systems and, or in some cases, reported out to public databases and dashboards, but sometimes after a period of internal quality control and review. And so I used to think early in the COVID response that the most important thing that we needed to do to reduce these delays and improve the timeliness of our analyses was to focus on building really slick, modern computational data management and reporting infrastructure so that we could reduce these logistical and sort of operational lags, right? I thought that the solution was going to be that a person should show up at a healthcare facility and in the blink of an eye, the information should flow out to all the other systems where we could analyze it. But the more time I've spent at CDC and learned about how the data systems work, the more I realize that, investment in that reporting infrastructure is important. And I think governments are doing that kind of investment. So the CDC is really focused on something called the Data Modernization Initiative, which is directly focused on kind of improving the plumbing that we have in the US for data to flow between facilities and then up into databases where it can be analyzed. But I'm increasingly convinced that this is only part of the solution and that no matter how good our reporting infrastructure becomes, I think that nowcasting is always going to be part of the solution for good real-time analyses and decision support. And the reason that I've started to think this is that, first of all, I've seen how difficult and expensive it is to move data around in real time and how much it strains these healthcare facilities, which are often at their breaking point trying to provide care to patients during public health emergencies and that don't necessarily have the capacity to make sure that data reporting is happening instantaneously. I also think that even with improvements to data infrastructure, like if we got to a place where there was no human effort involved, diagnoses change over time over the course of a patient's treatment. And so we should always, even under idealized situations, expect there to be revisions to the data as new diagnostic information becomes available. And I also think that day-of-week effects in the time series that we work with over and over illustrate how much of an influence human effort still has on the reporting process, even in healthcare systems where there is really good modern computational infrastructure in place to support almost instantaneous data management. And so I think that our job as modelers and nowcasters are to demonstrate a track record of performance to show that if nowcasts are sufficiently accurate, then they can be adopted in a widespread way as a more efficient way to improve this trade-off between data accuracy and timeliness in the long term. And so, you know, that was kind of big picture, but zooming back to the reality of where we are now, most of the surveillance data sets we work with are lagged. I think often we look at least a few weeks of either backfill, which I'm going to define as partially complete or preliminary reports that will be revised as the data come in, and true reporting lags, which I'm going to define as gaps between the last reported date in the time series and today. And because we have these multiple forms of delays affecting many of the surveillance systems we're working with, I think that there's been good precedent set to do some kind of a combination of what I think of as a nowcast, which involves estimating final reports from incomplete or preliminary counts at the end of the time series. So basically adjusting for backfill up to the last observed date, with essentially short-term forward projections, which are sometimes necessary to bring us from that last observed date up until the present and know what's going on now. And so, you know, once we have those forward projections to now in place, it's also really easy to extend them and generate 1, 2, or n week ahead forecasts a little bit into the future. And this is really the kind of forecasting tooling that I envision us building at CFA. The more I understand how the data systems work and the more we see the data systems change now that the public health emergency has ended for COVID, and we're sort of returning to steady state where there isn't as much funding or emphasis on getting the data into the federal systems immediately after it's reported. But I do think that this kind of widespread adoption of nowcasts is going to require a pretty big shift in the way some public health practitioners think about data collection and management. So I think that in a lot of corners of public health, there's this sort of traditional mindset where people prioritize accuracy over timeliness in the data, and where the goal is to produce a data set that is kind of finalized and analyses that are totally airtight at the expense of getting things out quickly. And I totally understand this mindset. I think that we saw a lot of examples throughout the pandemic that illustrate sort of the dangers of releasing public health guidance or information that has to be revised after the fact. So there really is a cost to not getting the answer right early. But I think that this kind of traditional data management paradigm has also led us to a place where there can sometimes be some embarrassment about the fact that the data aren't perfect immediately, and where incomplete, unrevised, or preliminary reports are basically considered garbage and they're discarded. And so as modelers and nowcasters, I think we all see the problems with these systems, right? This kind of data management makes it so that we can't effectively estimate things like delays to report stabilization or do the kinds of nowcasting that would allow us to have a better sense for what's going on in real time. And so what I'm hoping will happen, and what I've seen start to happen in some public-facing databases that are released by major public health organizations around the world, is a shift to more of a real-time analysis mindset where we're accepting that lags, revision, and backfill are inevitable, and we're prioritizing timely release of the data over perfection. And so I think that this transition is tricky, though, because it requires a lot of technical capacity, and that includes infrastructure to manage more complicated data sets, including archives or transaction histories and analysis pipelines that we need to be in place in order to have these kinds of real-time analyses running every day or every week so that we can monitor what's going on in real time from the incomplete reports. And of course, all of this also includes the need for human technical capacity, right? We need staff to be able to produce these kinds of pipelines, to run the models, and to help people interpret the estimates that come out the other end. And so I think that as modelers and tool developers, if our goal is to help increase public health capacity, then we need to play a role in demonstrating good practices for this kind of data management and helping to advocate for its adoption, especially in circles where it might seem risky to release data that isn't yet perfect, and to demonstrate good practices for pipeline building so that there are sort of standards and examples in place to implement these kinds of pipelines that run on a regular schedule and that don't just produce analyses, but produce evaluations of the accuracy of those analyses and estimates in combination. I also think that as tool developers, we really need to be thinking carefully about what the end use cases are for the kinds of nowcast and real-time estimates that we produce. So I've seen at CDC that there is a lot of interest in using nowcasting and modeling to understand the data in real time. But I think that a first sort of entry-level step that a lot of people want to start with are nowcasts for internal use and decision support. I think it's a much bigger lift to start releasing nowcasts as a public product. And this is definitely possible. Like, this is an example of nowcast that the CDC has started releasing every week to project forward current estimates of variant prevalence based on lagged genomic surveillance data. So it is possible to get these nowcasts out in the public domain. But as I said on the previous slide, I think that it's really important that if we want to move toward nowcast as a public product, that we're thinking about how to establish standard metrics and scoring evaluations, including those in the nowcasting pipeline. I've definitely seen examples where in some cases nowcasts have been implemented in the absence of this kind of scoring and evaluation. And so essentially people are receiving estimates, but there's no way for them to know how accurate they are. It would be an entirely different lift or an entirely different project to do that kind of evaluation. And it's really needed before people are going to feel comfortable releasing the estimates to the public. And I also think about nowcasts as potential inputs into downstream analyses, which I'll talk more about on the next slide, but which I also think informs some of the requirements for tool development, because it implies that in some cases we need to make it easy to port, say, the full joint posterior distribution of the nowcasting analysis and plug it into something that's happening downstream, or in some cases to do joint inference. Okay, and so that leads me to communicating and propagating uncertainty. So as I just said, I'd argue that if we want to do real-time analysis well, the gold standard would be that in the future, most downstream analyses should be built on top of a nowcast. And I think this includes things, like I said, like short-term forecasts, but also real-time estimates of parameters, including RT. But doing this well requires really careful propagation of uncertainty from the nowcast into the downstream analysis. And so I think that this is possible, but as we all know, I think generating the nowcasts or the parameter estimates themselves is a challenging technical endeavor. And I think that plugging in a nowcast to a downstream analysis just adds an extra layer of complexity if our goal is to be building tools that are really robust and ready to go off the shelf and to be building public health capacity. Because really what this means is that we have to understand how to propagate uncertainty efficiently from one model into the other. And in some cases, it might be true that joint inference is the most efficient way to do this, right? Doing the nowcast and the parameter estimate or the forecast within the same model might be the best path forward. But this puts us in a tricky situation as kind of engineers, because in some cases it might mean that every time there's a nowcasting innovation, we have to translate that innovation in parallel to the front of some kind of model that was built for another purpose, even if that model lives in STAN. And if we do, on the other hand, want to do the nowcast and downstream analyses as separate modules, we have to be able to develop outputs, as I said, that allows us to at least take the full posterior from the nowcast and pass it over to the next step in the analysis. And depending on what the next step is, that might be easier or harder. The other thing I want to emphasize is that now communicating uncertainty in general, I think, is one of the big challenges of real-time analysis, especially for public consumption. So smart people can misinterpret scientific visualizations that we take for granted because we've been trained how to interpret them. And so this hurricane cone is sort of one infamous example where if you show this to most scientists, we see the growing cone over time, and we understand that the cone is growing because there's increasing uncertainty as we project into future about where the hurricane is going to go. But if you show this to focus groups that include really smart and well-educated people from the public, sometimes people misinterpret this and think that the growing cone indicates something like that the hurricane is projected to grow over time. Or I've also heard examples from public health where people think that the boundaries between the different prediction intervals when we do analogous kinds of projection visualizations for infectious disease forecasts represent time series themselves, and that there's like kind of semi-parallel predictions being put forward on the graph. And so another thing that CFA is thinking about in general is working with the Inform division to try to understand how best to visualize and message the results that we produce. And I think that this kind of communication challenge is especially important for nowcasting, because nowcasts contain uncertainty. They also, in some cases, contain errors, right? Our estimates are not always going to be accurate estimates of the true final reports. And I also think that we need to think carefully about how to essentially explain how the sausage is made in the data reporting process so that the public becomes comfortable with this idea that the data are being revised over time and that these revisions are healthy and kind of inevitable. And then the last thing I think about in terms of challenges for widespread public health adoption is just the limits of nowcast accuracy. So I think there are some really nice examples of situations where nowcasts were inaccurate due to basically changes in human behavior or other kinds of anomalies in the epidemic trajectory. So this is one example, not from my work, but that illustrates really nicely that over Easter weekend, nowcasts underestimated the true total counts, and that was just because of underreporting over the holiday. So these are the kinds of anomalies in nowcasts that I think may be predictable to some extent, or that we might be able to adjust for statistically. But there are other situations where these kinds of reporting anomalies and inaccuracies are sort of intrinsically tied to outbreak situations where public health decision makers need answers. So early in an outbreak or situations where healthcare systems are over capacity and periods of social upheaval are all examples of times when we might expect there to be disruptions to the reporting pipeline that make it really difficult for us to produce accurate nowcast and real-time analyses. And I'm not exactly sure what the solution is here, but I think this is a fundamental challenge in real-time infectious disease analysis that we need to figure out how to address as a field. Okay, so that's all I have for you, but I'm interested in taking questions, and I hope you enjoyed it.
That was really great, Katie. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. And yeah, I don't know, perhaps worryingly, lots of new information in there. Right. Okay. So if anyone has some questions, I think we have about 15 minutes left still on the docket. While people get excited, I'm just going to launch in with one. I'll just go ahead of everyone. That sounds good. My thought was, this climate modeling graph that they show, where it's like, look how good performance is getting, aren't we great? Climate scientists are the best. Sorry, I've been to a couple of climate scientist forecasting talks recently where they just said that. Has there been any work you're aware of where they compare increases in computational power with their increases in accuracy, and if they show that it's not just because computers have got bigger? Because obviously their models are pretty physical, so you just make the patches better and they get better.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's possible that someone has done it. It sounds plausible, but I'm not familiar with the work if it exists. If anyone else
Yeah,
knows, certainly speak up.
indeed. We can have an actual question now, but I just think it's interesting to think about because otherwise we learn these lessons from all these people who are really annoying, but then maybe they're just wrong. Right, cool. Seb, I think your hand was up first.
Hi, and hi, Katie. Thanks. That was really great. And I have lots of questions, but I'll ask the maybe the obvious one for me, which is how do you see the balance between work that you're doing within the CFA and then work that's done by academic partners or other partners or research groups? Do you plan to kind of have a lot of interactions with people elsewhere, or do you think you've basically got it covered because you've got tons of great people now doing lots of stuff? Or just curious in how you see this.
I mean, we do have tons of great people, some of whom are on the call. But I think there are two answers to this question, and one is about where we are now, and one is about kind of where we're going. I mean, we're a brand new center. I started about 6 months ago, back in October 2022, and I was one of the first modelers in the door. I think I was the first modeler in the door at CFA. And so we now have about 20 modelers on staff, but we're only half staffed and we're really just getting started. And so right now we're really focused on just building kind of foundational models and infrastructure and tools. And I think this first round is going to involve a lot of pulling from existing tools and packages that already exist. Like we've been working a lot with Sam on making some modifications to EpiNow 2 for forecasting is just one example. I know. I think that long term, we will probably turn toward bringing management and implementation of a lot of these models in-house over time. And, we don't yet have this, but I talked about how eventually we'll have like software developers on staff in the innovation division, and professional support to do kind of tool and infrastructure maintenance. We're not quite there yet. We're really focusing on trying to train staff in some of the best practices for implementation, but there's just a long way to go. And so it's a bit of a combination of a focus on just like good modeling practices and building things that work and then cleaning them up. I think 2 or 3 years from now, once we have that kind of foundational infrastructure in place, I do think that the vision is for us to become sort of like the National Weather Service. Like we'll have a suite of tools that we're running and testing and identifying issues in. And I think what we're hoping for is that we'll have a close working relationship with academic and private sector partners where we talk about the issues that we're facing and where everyone is basically constantly trying to beat us. And then once an academic or private sector group can develop a model that can consistently outperform what we have, we'll basically like Pac-Man it in and try to clean it up and integrate it into the suite of tools that we already have running, and just sort of collaboratively innovate over time, or rather iterate over time. Is that helpful?
Great, thank you.
Okay, good question. We're going to go to Adrian in a second, but first, I just wanted to ask, do you think that model will actually happen? Because if you have 100 times the resources of these people who are going to compete with you, and if like the software development is super important and you have all the software developers and they don't have any of them, your methods are just going to de facto be better, even if the underlying methodology is terrible.
I mean, I think our hope is that
obviously.
I think our hope is that we'll release things in formats that are accessible to people for modification, like through pull requests and things like that. And I do think that we're also going to be working internally to improve the methods we have once we get into steady state. But there is always going to be a balance in CFA between like maintaining the tools that we have, trying to improve them, and doing kind of research and innovation. And then we also have to run them and produce analyses to support responses. And so I really think that it's going to depend on what happens in terms of outbreaks and epidemics and how much time we have to devote to that middle kind of innovation and research piece at any given point in time.
That makes sense. Carl has some interesting capitalist views in the comments if anyone's interested. Adrian, what your question?
I think Carl was first. But, okay, I'm just gonna run and then Carl can add. Yeah, thanks for the really clear presentation also. So one thing I wanted to ask about communication is that with when we account for example, like certain delays and deficiencies of the data that we get, there's always a bit this worries that by doing so, you basically take a little bit away also the incentive of improving the data collection and the generation. And so I was wondering if you have some thoughts on how in the communication part, what good strategies could be to also stress how our results can still improve if the data quality is improved, for example, or if additional information is provided.
Yeah. I think this is a good question. I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is that, as I said in the last couple of slides, I think that I'm interested to see what the limits of nowcast accuracy are in situations where decision makers really want to know the answer and where, you know, behavior or reporting systems might not be behaving in the ways that they have historically, right? Those kinds of emergencies can really limit the accuracy of nowcasts, and I think that itself creates an incentive to have timely reporting in place. I also think that if, on the other hand, we can do a reliable job nowcasting and have accurate and reliable estimates, then I'm not sure that it's totally essential to have reporting be instantaneous. But I think that we're a long way from getting to that point. And so I think that there will always be incentives for improving reporting practices and infrastructure. And I also just think that, you know, from a non-modeler's perspective in the public health world, I really think that people take pride in being able to get the data out quickly and knowing that it's trustworthy. And so I guess I'm not sure that I agree that the incentives are aligned in exactly this way, where like if we improve nowcasts, that people are no longer going to care about getting the data out quickly or making sure that they're accurate and quality controlled.
Awesome. Carl, sorry, you're finally allowed to speak.
So throughout the talk, kind of what I was hearing you use the word engineering mindset to mean was what I would call like a production versus benchtop kind of mindset, having a more refined tool, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, in some sense, we ought to just be doing science that way, right? A little bit more reliable, a little bit more robust, that sort of thing. Are you all thinking about that distinction in mindset, right? Distinguishing between, I don't know, scientific activity versus engineering activity in other important ways that you can elaborate on? Or is it kind of exclusively focused on this, let's just do a better job element?
I mean, I guess I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but I do think, like, I agree with the notion that a production kind of mindset is useful in scientific research too. I don't know that that's necessarily the way that we train infectious disease modelers right now in the academic system. And I'd like to see that change. One of the things that I was excited about when I started at CFA, although I'm not sure if this will really be something that we have bandwidth for the next few years, is, I mean, I think that it would be really helpful to compile training materials that we're using with our staff and try to help push for this kind of training in infectious disease modeling. But I think to the question of like the mindset of a distinction between scientific and production mentality, I mean, we definitely talk internally about like if someone is doing an exploratory one-off analysis, we're not necessarily asking them to implement using the full production mindset, right? Like we have an internal GitHub that people can basically use as a day-to-day lab notebook. So we want people to keep records of what they're doing, but there's space for people to explore and push things up and keep records of kind of scratch work, essentially. But when we get to a point where we're trying to do a project or where we're working together toward a goal, then we do want people to be working in more of like a production mindset so that things are tested and so that we have, so that things fit together and can be modular and so that there's institutional memory of how things work and that we can build off them later or take pieces and use them for other applications. Is that helpful?
Yeah. So if I'll revisit my question. I asked if you all are making a distinction between just doing production better versus doing engineering as like a different kind of thing to like a different end than just doing science. And it sounds like the answer is no, that you're just treating it as doing production better.
I think so, but I may not be fully understanding the question. We should talk about this later.
I think we should take this up async and just, I think we've got time for these last two questions. So Carl, I think it's a really good question. And to be honest, it's a question I've had, and I've had multiple different answers from different people in the CFA. So I think it's an interesting thing to think about. Caitlin.
I just had a question that's just probably gotten brought up in this seminar, since it's about nowcasting, but how do you like realistically and functionally think about how these nowcasts can pipe into downstream analyses? Is the vision like a centralized database where everyone, you know, if you're putting up a nowcast, like the CDC nowcast, of variant proportions that you showed, you'd have to have an S3 bucket with the posterior distribution? Like how do you guys think about this functionally? And it's a question to Katie, but also for this group more generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are multiple answers to this question, kind of depending on what it is that we're trying to build. I think that in the short term, probably what we're going to be doing is like nowcasts where the nowcast itself is the product and where it's just sort of being produced for internal evaluation. And this is largely because, I mean, CFA doesn't necessarily own data. We don't have direct responsibility for real-time monitoring of pathogens that are circulating and causing seasonal epidemics. And so really what we're trying to do initially is just establish the capabilities and support the programs that do have that responsibility and demonstrate accuracy and a track record. I think what we'd like to see longer term is publication of those nowcasts on the website. And then in terms of plugging them into our downstream analyses, I mean, I do think that for certain things, we will be building models where all the inference is happening simultaneously in the same place. Like, for example, for short-term forecasting, I think that approach makes sense for a lot of the things that we might try to do. But for other applications, like if we want to run an nowcast, say through like a time series model where there are established methods, then I think we have to think differently about like having the modeling modules be separate and plugging one answer into the other.
Nice.
Thanks.
I think there's a lot more. There's a lot of research there. Brandon, I think we've got time for one question, and then we should probably wrap up so that Katie can get on doing CFA stuff.
Yeah, quick question, just related to the pathogen priority list. Has it been established for the CFA yet? Is it an ongoing process, or is there a vision for which pathogens are of priority, of interest, or are, you know, how the input arrives to determine where the focus will be for the upcoming years?
Yeah, so we're kind of working on building this right now. As we're staffing up, one of the things that we want to do initially is, we're talking about which pathogens are on our priority list. And one of the first things that our team is going to do is just try to plug in probably with the WHO working group that's trying to estimate parameters, and maybe also do an internal review at CDC of the kinds of parameter estimates that our own centers are using so that we have some things ready to go. But I've been talking to Sam too about how I think that part of that review really should be with a focus on some of the more careful methods that have been developed more recently about adjusting for things like interval censoring and truncation and other kinds of lags and imperfections in the data, so that we can evaluate, what kind of biases might be present in estimates that were produced in the past, and really bring the most out of the data that we have available.
Great, thank you very much.
Awesome. Right. Thank you, everyone. Those are really good questions. I think we should probably wrap here, just so everyone can get on. But I posted in the chat thread the link to the community site where there's a post for this talk. And I don't know, Katie, but if you have time to take a look, if there are any questions there, that would be really good. Yeah, and I think we should all just have a little emoji clap for Katie again. Well, that was really good. Oh, yeah. It's nothing better than some emoji clapping. And yeah, so next time in July, we have James Hay of Cycle Threshold fame with a very enigmatically titled talk called The Most Important Operator in Infectious Disease Modeling and How to Use It with Biomarker Data, which is going to be about convolutions, which I love a convolution, so I think that should be quite fun. We currently have no speaker scheduled for August because people are on holiday, but if anyone is interested in speaking, then please reach out. And then after that, we have Sangui Park from Princeton talking about some work that I've been doing with him that Katie was kind of alluding to there a little bit, which is titled Estimating Epidemiological Delays in Real Time. So another pretty big general statement, so no doubt that would be great. And then after that, we have no currently scheduled talks. I think we have Anne Corey penciled in tentatively for November, but otherwise nothing else. So if anyone is interested in speaking or has any suggestions for speakers to reach out to, that would be really welcome. Awesome.